to provide her opening remarks. Can I please ask that all mobile phones are switched off in the room while Excellency delivers her keynote address? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Jody. I'm very, very happy to be here with all of you this morning. The friends and colleagues and collaborators and those that we have worked with before at different levels. And I'd just like to recognize, a few friends who are sitting here today. And especially those on the podium, Patrick Law, David Regal, Dr. Jody, and Janet. I have had the honor and pleasure and privilege of working with all of them for some time now. But let me begin by warmly acknowledging everybody that is seated here today and who's joining us, both in Nairobi and those that are participating online and who could not travel to be with us in person. Your presence here, whether physically or virtually, it really means a lot. It matters. This is a deliberately shared hybrid conversation. It's a space where African and global expertise can meet in real time across borders to shape what comes next. So today's roundtable, as Dr. Jody has told us, is convened by the Trade Negotiations and Investment Forum, TNIF, in collaboration with ODI Global, an institutional partnership that's grounded in a shared belief that trade policy must be both development-centered and evidence-led, particularly in an era of heightened geopolitical and technological disruption. We're especially pleased that ODI is so deeply woven into the life of TNIF, including through the leadership and engagement of Dr. Jody Kim, Principal Research Fellow at ODI, who is also a valued member of TNIF's advisory board. So let me say a word, and if you'll allow me, about TNIF itself, because it goes to the why of this gathering. TNIF is a pioneering think tank dedicated to catalyzing meaningful conversations on trade and investment in Africa and beyond, with a special focus on the concerns of developing and least developed countries. We are an independent, multidisciplinary organization that exists to drive positive change by promoting dialogue and analysis, and by strengthening understanding of how regional and global cooperation on trade and investment can advance economic and social well-being. Our mission is practical and forward-looking. It's aimed at promoting sustainable economic growth and development through trade and investment, and building negotiating capacity that reflects modern day and real needs across the continent and beyond. It's in that spirit that I wish to acknowledge with gratitude members of the TNIF Advisory Board who are with us here today, lending their wisdom to this conversation. We are honored to have in the room Patrick Law, former WTO Chief Economist, and George Riddle, Managing Director at Goida Limited, of course, together with Jody, who's also an advisory member. And Ambassador Ndirangu, he is seated here and is also part of our advisory board. So, colleagues, the foundational point of this workshop is reflection with purpose. We have come together 10 years after Nairobi to ask, what did Africa secure at MC10, and what must Africa now secure at MC14? In December, and this is a recollection, in December 2015, Nairobi hosted the WTO's 10th Ministerial Conference, MC10, presided over by Kenya, and under my chairmanship. That moment delivered tangible outcomes with global significance and real development meaning. And that includes the elimination of agricultural export subsidies and new disciplines on export credits, international food aid, agricultural exporting state trading enterprises, cotton, the ITA, electronic commerce, special safeguards for developing countries, LDC issues, TRIPS non-violation complaints, the foundation of what became known as the Nairobi package. It was proof written into multilateral outcomes that African leadership at the WTO can move negotiations from rhetoric to results. It also placed WTO at the front and center of multilateral trade negotiations, dedicating a substantive part of the declaration to confirming and reaffirming the centrality of trade for sustainable development and economic growth. That's why today we look forward with great anticipation to MC14 in Yaoundé, Cameroon next year, at a time when WTO reform is a priority for all members, yet interpreted in sharply different ways, with development priorities too often at risk of dilution. For Africa, the WTO reform agenda is not an abstract institutional exercise. It's inseparable from the everyday realities that shape our economies and our people's livelihoods, whether that's the price of food, the resilience of our farmers, the survival of small businesses, the reliability of supply chains, or the ability of our young people to access decent jobs. Reform debates about rules, flexibilities, and disciplines determine in real terms the policy space African governments have to industrialize, to diversify beyond commodities, and to respond to shocks from climate extremes, to commodity volatility, to geopolitical fragmentation. That's why Africa's interest in WTO reform must be anchored in development outcomes, not simply procedural fixes. The point is even more acute because the continent carries a large share of the world's least developed countries, LDCs. For many African LDCs, multilateral trade rules and support mechanisms are not optional add-ons. They are core lifelines for integration into global markets on fairer terms. So as we approach MC14, Africa has a direct stake in deliverables that will shape development trajectories for years to come, including decisions on LDC accession pathways, such as Ethiopia's, the launch of the third phase of the Enhanced Integrated Framework, which remains one of WTO's most tangible vehicles for aid for trade support in LDCs. These things matter because they speak to capacity, the ability to implement obligations, to improve trade facilitation, to strengthen standards infrastructure, to build productive capabilities, and actually convert market access into exports and jobs. And there's a wider principle at stake. If WTO reform is to have legitimacy, it must visibly work for those who face the steepest constraints. Countries with limited fiscal space, with infrastructure gaps, with vulnerability to climate impacts, and weak institutional capacity. A reform agenda that does not deliver if MC14 can demonstrate that reform strengthens rather than narrows the development mandate, it can help build trust in the system and create a steadier foundation for African countries to engage confidently in the next generation of trade negotiations on climate-related measures, on digital trade, on services, and on industrial policy. And that's why, precisely why, Africa must approach WTO reform with a dual lens, both global and continental, because our negotiating power and our development outcomes increasingly depend on how coherently these two tracks speak to each other. On the continental track, Africa has been standing still. through the FCFTA, and we are really happy to recognize that we have a representative from the FCFTA here to represent the Secretary General, His Excellency Omkele, and she's seated right here. So thank you very, very much for being here. So through the FCFTA, we have made important strides towards building a rules-based internal market that's explicitly future-facing. The FCFTA is not only about reducing tariffs, it's about creating the legal and institutional architecture for industrialization, for value chain integration, and for competitiveness. And crucially, for our discussions today, Africa is ready and already laying down continental rules and cooperation frameworks in two areas that will shape the next generation of trade: sustainability and regional digital trade. On sustainability, the direction of travel is clear. Trade policy is now being written in the language of climate risk, resilience, and green competitiveness, whether through product standards, carbon-related measures, supply chain due diligence, or new subsidy disciplines. Africa's continental integration agenda provides a platform to coordinate responses, to reduce fragmentation across 55 markets, and develop common approaches that protect our development space while helping African producers meet emerging requirements and capture green opportunities. On digital trade, the FCFTA Digital Trade Protocol is equally strategic. It signals that Africa intends to be a rule maker in the digital economy, not merely a rule taker. It offers a common continental framework that can support digital inclusion, enable cross-border e-commerce, and create predictability for digital services and digital enabled trade. But it also raises a central strategic question. How does Africa leverage this continental framework in the global negotiations now underway at the WTO? And this is where the connection between the WTO and Africa's continental institutions becomes essential. The WTO's ongoing negotiations on e-commerce and the digital economy, however they are ultimately structured, will shape global norms on issues such as cross-border data flows, source code, electronic authentication, consumer trust, and barriers to digitally delivered services. Africa cannot afford a situation where global rules evolve in ways that do not reflect African realities and then collide with or constrain the choices we are making under the FCFTA. Our task is to build alignment and leverage, to use the FCFTA Digital Trade Protocol as a foundation for a coherent African voice at the WTO, and to ensure that global outcomes support rather than undermine our continental integration, digital industrialization, and our development priorities. In other words, the FCFTA gives Africa a homegrown platform for coordination. The WTO is where global disciplines and market access conditions are negotiated. Our strategic advantage lies in connecting the two so that Africa's regional integration strengthens its negotiating leverage globally. And global rules, in turn, support Africa's continental transformation. So this convening here in Kenya, in Nairobi, is both symbolic and strategic. It's symbolic because Nairobi reminds us what is possible when Africa is prepared, when it's unified, and when it's ambitious. And I think we're prepared, we're unified, and we're ambitious right now. It's also strategic because it's the final run-up, a timely platform, 10 years after MCA, to help galvanize African priorities and build a consolidated, ambitious position as we approach Yaoundé. That's why the agenda is structured around three interconnected themes that now define the frontier of trade policy for Africa and for the world: WTO reform and the development mandate, trade, climate, and sustainable development, and digital trade. FCFTA and global rules. And that's why our objectives are deliberately action-oriented, to assess the legacy of MC10 and subsequent outcomes, and to define and consolidate a clear, unified set of African negotiating priorities for MC14 in Yaoundé, ensuring development remains central to the reform agenda. With that background, and with deep appreciation to ODI Global for its partnership in convening this moment of reflection and strategy, it's my honor to hand the mic back to Jody and Janet to now take us into the next session. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Dr. Amina Mohamed, for your opening remarks.